support. Vanessa, I've stolen a little bit of your time, but you take your time in the next segment. We're going to switch from matters to do with UK to Syria. But of course, the Middle East is so important as to what's happening in the world. What have you got?
Yeah, there's an awful lot going on at the moment. As I mentioned before we started, it's hard to keep up with it all, so I'll do my best. I do recommend that at my Substack, I'm trying to do a daily summary of the events in Syria and bordering countries. So if people want to keep up, they can follow me there. But first of all, let's start with what I consider to be some good news. The UN announces that a deal has been reached with Syria, meaning the legitimate Syrian government, to reopen, I would say, borders crossing from Turkey. 3 borders are potentially going to be reopened. And what this does also, in my view, is put the Syrian government and President Bashar al-Assad back in the driving seat of these border crossings. Of course, the control has been under the UN and predominantly Turkey, a NATO member state. And basically, the border crossings have been abused to supply weapons and provide revenue for the armed groups dominated by al-Qaeda. So this comes from the Syria's permanent representative to the UN, Bassem Sabah, announced on the 9th of August. The decision to open the border crossings comes in light of Syria's keenness on boosting stability, improving the humanitarian and livelihood situation of Syrians, and facilitating the delivery aid of people in need. Now, one would assume that the UN would be overjoyed by this, that a humanitarian aid improvement was going to be basically driven through the Syrian government to the Syrian people. But no, people can go to this article or freeze frame and read it for themselves. But basically what the UN said is that they can give no guarantees to the Syrian government that they will not deal with al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that are in control of Bab al-Hawa. And the British Charity Commission in 2018 warned charities against sending humanitarian aid through this crossing because al-Qaeda are using it to generate revenue, to extort high costs from Syrian civilians under their occupation. And equally interesting language from the UN, they say that the Syrians or the Syrian government deems HTS to be a terrorist organization. Well, the UN should know full well that both the US and the UK have prescribed HTS as a terrorist group. So extraordinarily obfuscating language by the UN as usual. They also say that the Syrian government request to send the humanitarian aid through Red Cross or Red Crescent is basically not possible because those organizations are not present in northwest Syria, in Idlib. Or quite simply, again, they omit the fact that they are not there because it's too dangerous for them to be there, and that their role is usurped by the CIA, MI6, White Helmet organization, and various offshoots of that. And they also say that the Syrian government's request to put all humanitarian aid through Syrian government control is up for review. So total obstacle creating by the UN. Just a very quick look at the map. You'll see the 3 crossings involved, the Bab al-Hawa we've talked about, Bab al-Salame, which has remained open unofficially and has been used by the White Helmets to bring equipment into the armed groups in the northwest, and the Al-Rai crossing to the right. So moving on. So what happens? So here is Syria trying to be constructive and trying to renew stability and security in Syria. What does the White House do? It refuses to renew the emergency sanctions waiver that it introduced when the double earthquake hit Syria on the 6th of February. The EU has extended until February next year, but the US, no. And of course, the US also has its anti-normalisation with President Assad bill going through, which will impose further sanctions on countries that will come to the assistance of Syria. We had another attack from Israel at 2:20 a.m. on the 7th of August. 4 Syrian Arab Army air defense personnel were killed in the attack, and there was some serious material damage including to civilian infrastructure. Those are the four killed, four Syrian Arab Army soldiers killed. And then moving on, we had President Assad gave an interview to Sky News Arabia. Part of his main statement was that those who stood by terrorism and plotted for war are the ones who bear responsibility for the destruction now inside Syria. But interesting, he also addressed the drug issue, which we have talked about with the BBC normalising HTS, a proscribed terrorist organization, to frame Syrian President al-Assad and to describe Syria as a narco state. So let's see what President Assad actually had to say as a rebuttal to these claims. So he said, if we are the ones seeking as a state to encourage the drug trafficking in Syria, this means that we as a state encourage the terrorists to come to Syria and to carry out destruction and killing, because the result is the same. If we put the people between terrorism on the one hand and drugs on the other, then we are destroying society and the country with our own hands. Where is our interest in that? And he also said, the drug trafficking is present and has not stopped. But when there is war and the weakness of the state, this trade could flourish. And those who bear responsibility in this case are the countries that contributed to creating chaos in Syria, not the Syrian state itself. I have to say this interview again demonstrates President Assad's clear-mindedness, his keen intellect, and his consistency. He hasn't deviated from his message since the beginning of this war. And coming back to the operations by Syrian authorities against drug smuggling, particularly in the south, on the 9th of August, Firas al-Ahmed, a Sama TV correspondent, was killed when he was covering one of the anti-drug smuggling operations, returning in their vehicle, which was blown up by an IED planted in the road by the various armed groups that still exist in the south. And he was killed. 3 Syrian army soldiers were killed, and a cameraman was injured. So what I want to do now is just demonstrate how Russian and Syrian special forces are combining to run tactical night military exercises with live ammunition, basically working on the liberation of civilians from occupied areas by al-Qaeda in Idlib. If we can just have a quick look at the video. So in those nighttime exercises, Russian Su-24 tactical bombers, Su-35 jets, Ka-52 attack helicopters participated, and this included a parachute and night airdrop by the Syrian Arab Army Special Forces using Mi-8 AMTSH helicopters. So this was a serious exercise. It's certainly not the first, but the timing is very important with the US military buildup. Last week, we talked about the US illegal Al Tanf base in southeast Syria on the borders with Jordan and Iraq. We know now that there is the intention to send 7,500 of the Turkish proxy terrorist groups, the Syrian National Army, predominantly Muslim Brotherhood, in 15 batches being flown into Al-Tanf from Erbil Airport in Iraq to reinforce Al-Tanf base, where it is believed that the US is building a terrorist hub to carry out attacks in the south and even against Damascus, as it has been doing. It's also worth noting that last night, late at about midnight, there was an attack by ISIS against a bus carrying Syrian Arab Army military. There were 23 Syrian army soldiers killed and at least a dozen injured. The US is working to secure the Al-Bukamal crossing in the northeast, which is currently under the control of the Syrian army and the Iraqi PMU forces. That will give them a direct supply line from Iraq down to Al-Tanf. So let's look at what the US is doing while it claims that it's reducing its military presence in the Middle East. It deploys more than 3,000 sailors and Marines to the Middle East following Iran's alleged targeting of ships. And moving on, we look at what Fox News says about this. So they announced the arrival Monday of more than 3,000 sailors following a call by the Department of Defense for additional troops after recent attempts by Iran to seize commercial ships in the CENTCOM area of operations. Let's see what Iran has to say about that through Press TV. The US Navy has several times seized Iranian-controlled tankers and shipments of oil en route to other countries, which includes Syria, bearing in mind the US is occupying Syrian oil. Citing its own sanctions on Iran's oil exports, Iran says it views US military vessels lurking in the waters of the Persian Gulf as a threat to its security and a source of tension and instability in the region. I can't disagree with that. And then let's see what the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Yemeni National Salvation Government, so the Ansarullah coalition government in Sana'a in Yemen, in the interest of international peace and security and to preserve the safety of navigation in the Red Sea, US forces must move away from our territorial waters because any approach could mean the beginning of the longest and most costly battle in human history. Very strong words from Yemen there.
Incredible, isn't it? So Assad speaks, nobody in UK hears because of this terrible censorship which is spread across the existing legacy media. So we're just going to say to our audience, please support what we're doing because you can see the close down coming. How can you support us? Well, join the UK column, become a subscriber, join the community where you can talk to other like-minded people. You can buy products via our shop. There will be, in the coming weeks, an update to the shop and more exciting things in stock, but also share the information. This is a key part of what we do, is to get the information out. Now, I just